Something was stalking the railroad workers in the Serengeti of Kenya. It was one of the worst animal attacks in history. But before we go there, make sure you subscribe, because we bring interesting stories that perplex the mind. Mahina was a construction foreman working in Kenya on the wild savanna. He was asleep in his tent with 3 other men. In the dead of the night, he would be ripped from that tent and dragged over 50 yards away by a large male lion, who quite literally would eat him alive. It was 1898, and Mahina was part of a large group of men recruited from local Kenyan tribes to help build the Uganda-Mombasa Railroad, a British-led project which helped expand their influence in the East African region, specifically what is now Tsavo National Park. It was a particularly challenging project, challenging terrain, and the fact that the local African sentiment at the time, they did not want to tear up and disrupt this holy land to build these Western modern railroads. They wanted it left untouched and pristine. So it was very hard for them to recruit local African men to work. They recruited as many locals as possible, but actually ended up getting most of their manpower from thousands of miles away by importing poor Indian workers. They would give them a contract with a promise to pay later. But these Indians were not accustomed to the dangers this East African bush possessed, like dangerous animals. It was backbreaking work, and the East African heat would end up claiming many lives to heat exhaustion. A lot of the bodies they would end up just leaving on the roadside while the construction project continued on. But eventually they hit a river and work stopped. They would be stuck in that one place for what would turn out to be many, many months. They needed someone with more expertise to complete this bridge over the river, so they ended up hiring John Henry Patterson, a British military engineer and avid big game hunter. Upon arrival, Patterson learns from the camp's doctor that they've been having severe lion attacks, the worst that anyone has ever seen. The Indian workers, especially thousands of miles away from home, they were absolutely petrified and they didn't want to work in these conditions. So priority number 1 was to deal with these lions. Patterson, the determined military man that he was, decides to camp out in the trees and stake out the lions for a couple of nights. And he's actually able to kill one of the lions with 1 rifle shot, a feat that ends up earning them massive respect inside of the camp. So work is able to continue on the bridge. Only a few weeks after Patterson kills the lion, Mahina, the construction foreman, is dragged from his tent and killed by the lion. So Patterson, with his one-shot reputation, decides to go on another nighttime lion hunt. But he doesn't actually end up finding anything. And come sunrise, they find out that the lion's taken another victim on the other side of this huge camp. To give perspective, an American male mountain lion is around 140 pounds. A female African lion is around 300, with the males being up to 450 pounds. Your head could fit in its mouth, and the size of its paws could crush ribs. They decided to use an age-old African defensive bush tactic. They took branches from the acacia tree with 3-inch long thorns and built a giant thorn fence line around the entire camp, and then also burned fires at night to help keep the lions out. But they must not have known that some lions can jump as high as 12 feet. Several days later, one of the lions jumps the fence barrier and kills yet another worker. No one had ever seen anything like this. It was unheard of. 2 separate lions paired up hunting humans, just not something that happens. It's usually a solitary type of event. So with this victim count mounting up inside of this camp, the legend of these 2 man-eating Tsavo lions keeps growing and growing and growing, spreading terror across the entire camp. The huge death toll and these workers not wanting to go to work, Patterson has a huge problem on his hands. So he tries hiring local Maasai tribesmen to hunt the lions, who have a fierce reputation. But the Maasai elders, they refuse to help, because they don't think these are ordinary lions. They think that they're 2 evil spirits enacting revenge on the workers for destroying and disrupting this natural, pristine landscape. They nicknamed these 2 man-eating lions the Ghost in the Darkness. Work on the railroad is backbreaking, and so is the African heat. Diseases like malaria are running rampant through the camp, and accidents are happening. They house these sick and injured people in a makeshift hospital. But the smell of blood from these people is attracting the lions in like a dinner bell. Patterson decides he's going to try and use this. He moves the hospital to a new location and uses the old hospital building as a sort of lion trap. They fortify the building and then arm themselves inside of it. They spread animal meat and blood all around the building to help attract the lions in. But as you may have guessed, the plan doesn't end up working. So they have to revert back to another traditional tactic. They tie a baboon to the ground and then camp out in the surrounding trees. Lions love to hunt baboons, but the baboon is particularly useful because when it's used as bait, it's really good at sensing when a lion is nearby and alerting with its high-pitched screaming. So Patterson, using this tactic, after a couple of nights, they end up being successful and they're able to shoot and kill one of these lions. But the carnage doesn't end there. The remaining lion continues to hunt and kill people wandering just outside of camp, and even venturing inside to attack. So what they end up doing is they torch all of the tall brush surrounding the camp, so no lion has anything to hide in. And eventually, they're able to kill this last remaining man-eating lion. In 1907, Patterson's story was told in a popular book called The Man-Eaters of Tsavo. And later a movie was made called The Ghost in the Darkness, featuring Val Kilmer and Michael Douglas. Originally, it was thought that these two maneless lions were driven to human prey from desperation and hunger. But modern studies think that they got a taste for humans by scavenging the dead bodies of workers that were just left along on the roadside. Eventually, they started hunting live humans, and over the course of a few months, they grew braver and braver, venturing inside of the camps. Studying the dead lions, they found abscesses on their teeth, which they assumed would make it harder for them to catch their traditional prey of wildebeest, zebra, and gazelle. So they sought easier game. Another theory suggests that Patterson, an avid big game hunter, embellished the story to attract Western white hunters and settlers to the region. Killing a lion, aka the king of the jungle, was a metaphor for conquering Africa. Records indicate that these legendary Tsavo man-eating lions killed over 135 people in the region, giving birth to the legend of the Ghost and the Darkness. Have you heard of the Ramree Island massacre? Alright, this is scary, but you're gonna love this. The Allies fought a brutal war in the Pacific during World War II. Their main adversaries, the Japanese, would take over hundreds of islands that the Allies later had to clear out. They would embed themselves so deeply in these islands with defensive structures that they were just notoriously hard to uproot. In 1942, they took over Myanmar, which is formerly known as Burma. Now, just off the coast of Myanmar sits Ramree Island. It's roughly 500 square miles. The Japanese wanted the island so they could build airstrips and launch air raids to the mainland from island cover. The British were tasked with attacking the island and dealing with these airfields, small part of Operation Matador. So they led an amphibious attack at the north end of the island by the port. First they pummeled it with heavy artillery from the Navy. Then they dealt with the Japanese water mines, before landing an invading force on the beachfront. The larger main Japanese stronghold was further inland, and it had well over 1,000 troops. But when the British outflanked them, for mixed reasons, they decided to abandon that position and go across the way to the other side of the island and rejoin another Japanese troop. But the problem with that was there was this 10-mile stretch of tropical swampland that they had to get across. This proved not an easy task because the swamp was thick with mud, it had very deep water, and it had a dense population of these mango trees that grow in the water. It was hard to get through. With the terrain being so difficult and progress so slow, it's believed that none of them actually made it to the other side. Because their emperor, Hirohito, was revered as a god, they would rather die than surrender. Surrender was not an option. So, when they were stuck in that position in the swamp, they had to start fighting it out with the British from that position. It ended up being perilous. The swamp was rampant with mosquitoes, tropical disease like typhoid fever. They had no resupplies and little to no water. There was something a little more sinister lurking in that swamp. The swamp was infested with hundreds of saltwater crocodiles, significantly more aggressive and much larger than American alligators. Some can grow as much as 20 feet long. Once the crocodiles started to attack, more crocodiles came, and they forced a lot of these troops to take refuge in the mango trees, which sit out of the water. But during a high tide, these guys aren't that far out of the water. And crocodiles in nature have been known to jump out of the water to catch prey on low branches like monkeys and birds. Some crocodiles can jump out of the water as much as 8 feet. So what do you think the crocodiles did with these soldiers stuck in these trees of this swampland? They started attacking them. They were jumping out and plucking them right out of the trees. And the larger crocodiles would use their tail as a battering ram to slam into the tree to try and shake out their prey. It's absolute carnage. Here's what probably happened. They tried to cross. Maybe even some of them got across. But once the crocs really started to hit, more crocodiles came in and started swarming. And so they couldn't cross anymore. And the British are starting to surround them on all the other sides. So they eventually get stuck inside of this swamp, pinned down. Can't do anything. Some drowned, some starve. They are dehydrated, they're undersupplied, low bullets, they're just desperate. So these crocodiles, hundreds of them, are swarming around this swamp, and eventually over the course of weeks, they just keep picking off more and more men. One British man was quoted as saying this: "You could hear the random rifle shots echoing through the night, followed by the piercing screams of the men being taken by these giant reptiles. When the day broke, the vultures came in to clean up what the crocodiles had left. 1,000 soldiers of the Japanese garrison escaped into the crocodile-infested mango swamps. The Allied troops used boats, interpreters, and loudspeakers to communicate and ask them to come out and surrender. Not a single one did. Crocodiles killed over 500 men. The Guinness Book of World Records stated that it was the largest loss of human life to animals in history. Another report says that of the 1,000 Japanese men that went into the mangrove swamps, only 20 came out alive. The crocs of Myanmar were hungry. July 1945. Harold Bray, a Navy man, was asleep in his chain bunk that suspended 15 feet above the metal deck, along with hundreds of other sailors. He was aboard the USS Indianapolis, a 600-foot heavy cruiser for the Navy. 4 years prior, the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor sparked a brutal Pacific battle between the United States and Japan. And this caused the US Indianapolis to set sail underneath the Golden Gate Bridge on a secret mission. The mission was to deliver uranium that would be used in the first atomic weapon, known as Little Boy, that devastated Hiroshima. As we all know, Hiroshima happened. So the Indianapolis mission was a huge success, but on the way back they would be struck by 2 Japanese torpedoes. Harold Bray, the last living survivor of the Indianapolis, reported that the torpedoes hit around midnight while he was asleep in his bunk. The blast was so devastating that it shook the entire ship, causing him to fall from his bunk 15 feet below to the metal deck. The lower compartments quickly filled with water, trapping people. Luckily, he was able to find his way in the dark through all of these other men panicking, made it to the stairs, and got up to the main deck. By now, the ship was starting to break apart, and the bow was beginning to lift up into the air. So he had no choice. In the pitch black night, he jumped over 40 feet below to the black oily water. Since there was quite a bit of debris from the blast floating in the ocean, he was able to find a floating cargo net and grab hold of it. From there, he watched in horror because it took only 12 minutes for the Indianapolis to sink, never to be seen again in 3-mile-deep ocean. About 1,200 men were aboard, and 300 would get stuck and go down with the ship, leaving 900 men floating in the open ocean. It's midnight. There's zero visibility. Almost 1,000 men are floating in this ocean, yelling, screaming, some of them severely injured. Dead bodies, debris. It's a massive disaster. No one really knows why. Maybe it was because the ship was on a top secret mission that it already completed, But for whatever reason, no distress signal was ever sent out. So no one knew that these men were even in the water, and worse yet, nobody was coming to look for them. They would float in that ocean, trying to keep it together for 5 long days. In those type of conditions, many of the men would die from exposure, dehydration, and saltwater poisoning. The sound from the explosion echoed through the water, as well as the blood from the dead and injured. This attracted sharks, mainly the oceanic white-tip shark, which can reach about 13 feet in length. Initially, the sharks feasted on the dead bodies, but eventually they started picking off the injured. As they did, more and more blood entered the water, which caused more and more sharks to be attracted to it. The men testified that there were probably hundreds and hundreds of these sharks, causing an all-out feeding frenzy. The men tried to group together real tightly to defend themselves, and when a shark would get close, they would thrash and scream in the water trying to scare it off. Sometimes the sharks got scared and went away. Sometimes they didn't. But they never really ever left. They're always lurking just below the men's feet. The sharks would swim at full speed and ram into the group of men. Along with the rough seas, the men were getting sloshed around. This sometimes caused some of the men to accidentally drift away from the group, and once they were off by themselves, the sharks would take them. Harold stated that you could hear men screaming and thrashing in the water all throughout the night and into the day, where you could literally see them panicking before getting dragged underneath the water. Kills the sharks were making just put more and more blood into the water, which just ramped them up and made the situation worse and worse. Sometimes the sharks would just probe and circle around, come close and test. Sometimes they would attack, but they were always nearby. Harold dipped his head into the water, and he could see tons and tons of these sharks swarming underneath him. He may have survived from this cargo barrier net that he used as a raft. That didn't stop the sharks from bumping and nipping at him repeatedly throughout these 5 days. And the sharks weren't biting. Some men were going delirious from thirst or saltwater poisoning from drinking this oily seawater. Harold stated that men were hallucinating off this, and they would yell that they saw a rescue ship that wasn't there, and they would start swimming out towards it, and you would never see him again. When the Indianapolis failed to reach its designated port in Guam, it was noticed, but it wasn't reported properly. Perhaps from the nature of a secret mission or flat-out incompetence. It's unclear. The men would float in the open Pacific for 5 long days before being spotted by a scout plane and rescued. Of the 1,200 men aboard and the 900 men that entered the water alive, many of the men would perish from the elements. It was the biggest loss of life in U.S. naval history and the worst mass shark attack in history. 900 entered the water, only 316 men survived to tell the tale. The sharks took the rest.